We're moving from an era of cheap, abundant energy to an era of scarce, hard-to-get, expensive energy.
One barrel of oil, the refined product of which 42 gallons of gasoline you can buy for a little over $100, will produce as much energy, as much work, as you will get from 12 people working all year for you.
Take an average man performing physical labor for 25,000 hours to produce the amount of energy that's contained in that one barrel of oil. That barrel of oil, if it's pulled out of the ground in Iraq, can be pulled out of the ground for $1. You invest $1 and you get back 25,000 hours of human labor. That's an energy source that is so dense, it's essentially free energy. Oil is our God. I don't care if somebody says they worship Jesus, Buddha, Allah, whoever. They actually worship petroleum.
70% of the barrel of oil is refined into transportation fuels, which include motor gasoline, diesel fuel, jet fuel, railroad fuel, and maritime fuel. 98% of all transportation energy comes from oil.
Значит, Россия вышла на первое место по добыче нефти. Эшелоны с бакинской нефтью шли туда, на фронт. Шли на фронт. В 2020 году к этому времени Баку был одним из крупных промышленных нефтяных центров.
Venezuela discovered oil at the beginning of the 20th century. The real first discovery was about 1914.
The real turning point was on the 16th of December of 1922 when there was a blowout in a well that was being drilled at Cabimas. It became known as the Day of the Black Rain. 150,000 barrels in the air for 2 or 3 days running. And that put Venezuela on the world oil map once and for all.
And at one time, Venezuela became the largest exporter in the world.
The United States, not Saudi Arabia or the Middle East, that was the world's leading producer of oil. And in fact, much of our military and industrial might arose out of our giant oil industry.
McCamey was a boom town for many, many years. Their attitude was that this was going to last from now on. I know that those people then could not foresee you were ever going to pump all the oil out of the ground in this part of Texas. And they couldn't picture ever running out of oil because it was everywhere and got on everything. Of course, now we realize that you're going to deplete your supply sooner or later. They're not making a lot of dinosaurs anymore.
I suppose that the classification of reserves depends on the motivations of the person that's classifying them.
Sort of keep people guessing in a way, keep them off balance. Most numbers that you will see around the world that lead to these numbers that we were talking about include proven plus probable, and sometimes even possible.
In fact, the public data is extremely misleading and misunderstood. OPEC exaggerated how much oil it's got left for all sorts of political reasons. In 1985, Kuwait overnight added 50% to its reserves. At that time, the OPEC quota, that is the amount of oil that each of the OPEC countries could produce, was based on the reported reserves. So the more you reported, the more you could produce. 2 years later, Venezuela doubled its reserves overnight, and that caused the other countries, finally Saudi Arabia, to announce enormous increases overnight, simply to protect their production quota. These numbers have not changed since, and it's absolutely implausible to imagine that the number should stay the same when they're all the time producing.
OPEC countries do not care about what might happen from now, 20 years from now, or 30 years, or 40 years from now. They care about what they get now, today.
The United States has been the largest oil producer on Earth for almost 100 years, and nobody thought we'd ever peak.
Throughout this half-century, Dr. Hubbard has been a continuous student of energy resources and their implications in human affairs. As long as 20 years ago, Dr. Hubbard was pointing out to his colleagues in the petroleum industry that the United States would probably reach its peak of petroleum production within 10 to 15 years.
He was virtually laughed out of his profession for making such a ridiculous prediction. He realized that oil discovery had peaked in the 1930s and was declining. And he could extrapolate that to figure out how much oil there would be altogether. The amount that you discover initially starts out rising very rapidly, but after a while it slows down because there's less of it to discover, and eventually it will turn over and come back down again like that. Now, the rate of production of oil, of extraction or use of oil, will be a second bell-shaped curve, and it comes necessarily later than this because you have to discover it before you can produce it. So there'll be a second curve like this for production. And it too will eventually go to zero. And this peak here, the peak in the production curve, is what's referred to as Hubbard's peak.
M. King Hubbard had predicted that worldwide it should be occurring about the turn of the century. That slipped a little because of the Arab oil embargo and the oil price spike hikes and the worldwide recession that reduced the demand for oil quite significantly. And it's now pushed peak oil off till many people believe about now.
As we look around the world into other countries, we see this same pattern being repeated in one country after another. Today, there's about 58 countries that are physically producing less today than they have in the past.
The last great frontiers of new oil discoveries turned out to be Alaskan North Slope oil, Siberian oil, and the North Sea. And those discoveries happened in kind of 1968, 69, 1967, 68, and 69.
The world has now been sufficiently explored for the oil industry to know now all the promising areas. All the big promising areas have been identified.
We're always a drill bit away from some fabulous new territory. That's the great thing about exploration. But realistically, it's been a long, long period of time since we've actually discovered a significant new basin.
At the same time, we are making ourselves dependent on some extremely unstable regimes in some very nasty parts of the world.
Oil is a magnet for war. Oil starts wars. The first war that was absolutely about oil was Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, which was really about seizing an oil field.
Not 1 in 50, not 1 in 100 of the people in our country have any inkling of the potential problem that we're facing.
Increased unemployment, poverty, bankruptcy, starvation. There are all kind of the things that happen when a society collapses.
If we wait until peak oil to start making the transition, there will be very serious economic consequences. If we anticipate it by 10 years, there will be meaningful economic consequences. To have no economic consequences, you need to anticipate it by 20 years. I'm almost dead certain we don't have 20 years. I don't think we have 10 years. I think we're pretty much there.
Thank you all for coming. Please be seated. Lay the facts out for everybody to see.